Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, most importantly, an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And of course, most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig a little bit deeper. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal performance success, a comprehensive discussion on developing elite coaches and players. With almost, we are so close to 50 episodes to date. Today's topic plays its own role, like so many other episodes, in developing the player, parent to coach for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today. Oh my goodness, how far we've come. Look, if you were new, I really would encourage you to catch up on especially our last, 2 to 3 episodes to really get a feel for where we're at today. If you are one of our loyal followers, one of our loyal listeners that have been with us for some time now, thank you so much. You know where we're at. I just want to preface today's episode because we have actually finished a few episodes ago now, the secrets to optimal performance success, and diving into each individual chapter intricately. And obviously, if you want to review, I think those are the individual parts, and I'd encourage you just to have a look back at well over 40 episodes. We're at 49 episodes today, which is really exciting. So we really have that extensive catalog to refer back to now. But today's episode, we're actually at the final segment of that first chapter, which is the coach-athlete relationship. And essentially, the section which we're yet to just delve in a bit more broadly about is performance expectations and where do you stand. So again, obviously, there's a whole segment on this, but again, and I've shared this in our last couple of episodes, is that since we've finished the secrets to optimal performance success, we now have an opportunity to dive in deeper and to really piece things together. Because I think individually, each topic, it's just so rich and filled with just key aspects to implement within your game and your coaching practices. And also for the parents and or guardians out there, applications and or implications. It really depends on obviously what the topic is and or discussed, and the practices that we've shared that are also involved. But today, when we're looking at those, performance expectations, really want to focus back on that coach-athlete relationship, but also that triangular relationship, which brings that parent and or guardian into play. Because I think, hopefully we can all agree, today's world, it's very different to what it was maybe 10, 20 years ago. A constant, however, is pressure and expectations, though I would argue that potentially those expectations and that pressure has increased. And we have had episodes where we've touched on this, and I'm sure it's of no surprise when I point out social media. And what I mean by that is the interactions and that constancy in this respect, or the continuous cycle of that involvement. Because if you think back, for those of you who can, when social media wasn't around, which I think we're going on around 15-ish years ago off the top of my head. It could be give or take, probably maybe a little bit more. But that's when some of you will recall MySpace, and I guess when that was around. And in more recent years, it's actually been 7 years roughly since Topic Thread was created, and that is the social network I founded. It was my baby, my startup, which really came to light to counter, let's say, the negative noise. And I'm saying the negative noise in respect to the social media context and or environment because the market, as everyone's familiar, is very saturated. Now, I'm going to be very mindful here to not make today's episode about social media and or that social network and or platform, but the conversation is really around that noise and or negative noise, and that it's constant, that there is rarely an off switch and or button to, I think, move away from. Now, the reference that I made in respect to MySpace, it was very slow back then. But for those of you who are familiar, it was actually quite fast for us. However, now it would be painstakingly slow. Though the benefit there is that you did not have the time, or you knew you had to put that time aside to look at your feed on MySpace, for example, opposed to now you can go on Instagram, Threads, Twitter, TikTok, and you just keep swiping and swiping and swiping, and before you know it, 30 minutes has passed away. And recently, and I will put my hand up, more recently, when the podcast Beyond Top 10 Tennis started, I really wanted to make an effort to share, which did mean after a good, I want to say roughly 6 years, I had removed myself from every single social platform, almost. But let's say in this context, all of them except Topic Thread. Now, I knew because of the scope of Topic Thread, bear with me, that I would need to step outside, so to speak, and put my hand up to say hi on the other platforms for Beyond Top 10 Tennis. And in doing so, ironically / unfortunately, I have become susceptible to those algorithms. So for those of you out there who are equally susceptible, oh my goodness, yes, I had almost forgotten how they worked and why I stepped aside from them, and they're a bit of a bugger. So, I mean, and I hope those of you listening are familiar with that saying. Now, from that, I think, let's say, lesson, it's really simplified. So imagine being really invested. And this is coming from someone who really is not invested. My level of interest in this respect is to reach out to you potentially and or potential listeners to share what we have, what we're talking about, what's available. And hey, if you are a tennis player, an athlete, a coach, and or a parent and or guardian with an interest in this space, it's just encouraging you to jump on board where we are now. The downside though is that negative noise, because all of you, I'm sure, are aware that even if you open one social media app and your intent is to be on there just a quick check for that 5-10 seconds, that can very easily turn into 5-10 minutes. And so the conversation around that negative noise is when we're looking at expectations to pressure, it's all of what's around. Whereas once upon a time, that was not available. You could go ahead, do what you wanted to do, train, practice, and get to where you want to go without the negative noise. or the interpretation of that negative noise, it was very different, and it was not constant. To get in contact with a friend, you could not do that on your mobile because mobiles were very rare to actually have. And part of me cannot believe as well that I'm having this conversation, though I do fortunately remember that being the case and the benefits. But then on the flip side, I also remember when mobiles were very commonplace, even say 10, 15 years ago. And I actually remember when I was an athlete training full time and I was actually working full time, it was a very busy, hectic period. I remember having my phone in one hand and my tennis racket in another. Now, that was going back over a decade ago, well over a decade ago, which just goes to show that the distractions that were available then, and now we know they're even more amplified. But we also know the likelihood of taking photos, pictures, videos, just everything I think that falls under that banner, whatever you choose and or prefer, that is an added layer. And I'm going to call it a distraction, because your core focus here, when we're looking at, let's say, tennis more specifically and or your performance, it's about just setting that time aside, and we do like taking, obviously in every episode, that humanized approach. So this is just as applicable for the individual, irrespective of what you are focusing on and your intent is. You're trying to quiet that negative noise. You just want the positive is very different. But when we're talking about the negative, it's really the expectations, and so the pressure that comes with that is not welcome. So I want to share my results with my followers and all my friends, because I feel like I need to, and or I have to, or I feel propelled or compelled to really want to. Whereas the alternative could be, no, I'm just going to share that in person when the chance arises, opposed to distracting myself. And the more people we invite into our circle, so let's say our circle of influence, the people you surround yourself with, the more susceptible you become to that pressure. And I think that's a very big one that is overlooked. Now, for those of you who have been following for some time, you know that I am actively writing towards my latest book, which will be published later this year. Yes, I am on a very tight deadline. We are getting there. I did not think I was going to get there, but I'm sure we will. Now, there's an episode a few back where I spoke about pressure, and that I put my hand up to say I am also vulnerable as well to experiencing that and the side effects, and they're not nice. They do not leave a very good taste in your mouth, so to speak. And I'm trying to be able to share, but also we want to develop good practices, and that's where obviously the data and the science comes in, but also the conversation, which is really interesting because it's something I am writing about. So you should hopefully be able to get your hands on this, I think, in more detail. Christmas time, fingers crossed. But where I'm going here, it's about, you've got all this noise potentially, and you have this pressure and you have those expectations. So what does it look like if that is not there? What does that environment look like for you if you're able to reduce that? What does that look like for you if your circle of influence is quite small? Now, in this respect, let's jump back over to, the focus of the chapter being the coach-athlete relationship, but specifically that triangular relationship, because we've touched on the coach-parent relationship. So the coach and parent and or guardian work together for the best interests of the child and or player-athlete to make sure their inner circle is supportive and positive, and they're looking after and they've got the best interests of that child and that player athlete at heart. The player athlete, then comes in, and they are well looked after. It is that circle of influence is very small, but it's good and it's healthy. And then let's broaden it a little bit. You have your closest friends, your best buddies out there, your mates, and they are on the same page. Now, we're talking about those friends, those mates, those best buds that also support you. They also could be playing tennis. They could be in another sport of choice. It does not matter. They may not be in a sport, but you support each other in whatever it may be that you do. So that's a healthy influence. That's a good influence. That's good noise in that inner circle. Now we're trying to protect that, to maintain, let's say, the health, viability of this circle. Now, cracks will begin to come in when that negative noise comes. So that negative noise may be from an outsider in person, but you could leave yourself open to that vulnerability and or susceptibility through social media, if you allow that in. Now, there are tools and or controls in place where you can limit comments, or you can have a private account, which I incredibly encourage, especially when we're on this topic specifically, because it is a way of keeping that inner circle strong and healthy. And if your core objective is to stay on that pathway towards a top 10 tennis ranking, that is absolutely fundamental. Now, on that point, we've had players more so in the last, I want to say 1 to 3 years, speaking up about mental health, which we do have episodes on, and public perception and the negative influences. So let's say that negative noise, and that has been experienced online. Now, if you are one of those players inside the top 50, the top 20, or top 100 for that matter, to top 10, irrespective where you're standing on that elite spectrum, potentially you are susceptible to this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the impact it has had on you as a player, and also your performance. But I think most specifically for today's episode, your inner circle. Now, it's so important if you are not within, let's say, that ranking range, so you're not exposed to that at this stage yet. It's preparing you that this could happen, and it's also trying to prevent it, because when it does happen, of course it's not nice, and you need to have the tools to manage it. So imagine if you are, and potentially you're listening, you're that 12, 13-year-old, and you're already getting that negative noise. It is so incredibly counterproductive compared then to that, that 23-year-old, that person 10 years older than you, dealing with it. And even still, we can acknowledge when by the time you are 23 years of age, even though you are recognized as a young adult, you are still developing. You are not at your full potential from performance and or professional in any way, shape or form. You're at the very beginning of your career, which means you are trying to manage all of the excitement that comes with being a professional tennis player, and also with that, the potential noise. And when we're talking about that noise, it's what if you are 15, 16, 17 and you've been dealing with that noise for a number of years? You really need to ask yourself, are you putting your performance first? If you are not protecting your inner circle, if you are not trying to foster positive noise opposed to negative noise, then we know that, let's say that the foundations you're setting are not in line with that top 10 tennis ranking. Now, I'm really passionate / excited, and so many emotions wrapped into one, because the latest publication, it is specifically unveiling that pathway towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So everything I'm sharing and saying, some of it is going to be in the book, but other parts have facilitated the capacity to make it possible. And I've talked about all of the texts to date, which is 11 texts. 10 of those are incredibly specific towards developing that top 10 tennis ranking. That 11th book is obviously my fictional release, which would say it was a bit of a let's come up for some fresh air, opposed to just really getting down to the nitty-gritty, because it really is entrenched in data and really heavy. And oftentimes my challenge is relaying what that really means in practical terms for you. Because more often than not, the scientific literature is shaped towards the scientific community. And whilst I'm a part of that community, I also acknowledge that my work isn't really for them. It is, but do the scientists out there want to develop a top 10 tennis ranking? Most likely not. The work though, are there children out there, young adults, coaches, parents, guardians that want to know how to specifically develop a top 10 tennis ranking with science backed, like behind it? Of course they do. And I am positive if you're listening, you are one of them. And or you know someone that wants to know in that way and or shape or form, which is incredibly important. And performance expectations, both when they're collectively considered, it's so important to set a healthy precedent, to learn those tools to remove that negative noise from the very beginning. And oftentimes this is not done, or strategies are not employed to ensure this is maintained. And this could mean simple tactics from leaving your phone in another room, etc. It also, it's quite, let's say, a complicated matrix, which really just makes it even more complicated, because you obviously, we've spoken about that humanized approach and your identity in previous episodes, and you want to upkeep that inner circle and the positive influences, but you also have that personal life, that other side of your identity. And it's keeping in touch with your friendship circle and your group. But that does not mean you still can't quiet out that negative noise, because if any one of those friends and or friend is a negative influence in a way, shape or form, it's about removing that. And if you are unsure, it's about building, I think, that level of resilience, but also confidence as well, your self-worth and self-esteem. And we do have episodes on that to really set you up for that pathway ahead. But I think most importantly, it gives you the tools. So let's talk a bit about that now. Because look, the secrets to optimal performance success is really jam-packed, but specifically chapter 1, which we're on today as well, and that final part is about the expectations and the pressure that you are susceptible and or vulnerable to. But let's have a look at the tools that you can put in place. Now, I think number one, I'm really talking to the players, athletes here, but I'm also going to draw on, the parents, the guardians, and the coaches, because we do also have episodes on the power of mentoring and or mentorship. So the coaches out there, we really want to rely on you to mentor your players, to really lead by example and to set those boundaries that, this is okay, no, this is a firm no. If someone is disrespectful or impolite in any way, shape or form, or they do not deserve a seat at your table, they do not deserve a part in that inner circle. And it's really being firm to help set up these boundaries long term. Now, this could be very early on, 13, 14, 15 years of age, but we're also finding this age range is becoming more susceptible. Whereas maybe 10 years ago, it was a little bit older. But again, I think things have changed because of those external influences, and we need to be mindful of that. So let's go to the parents and or guardians here. It's equally important, not necessarily from a mentoring perspective, but I think we can all agree the role of a parent is to protect their child, to make sure they're in healthy, conducive environments. And ask yourself those simple questions. Have I built or am I building that healthy and conducive environment for my child where they can thrive? Do they feel safe? Do they feel heard? And we can look at specifically one of my texts, or my latest one that was released, the scientific, the 7 keys to optimize your life. So that obviously has those scientific implications there. But it has the transference. So again, it takes, I think, a new approach to that humanized approach, where it really shares or uses tennis as that vehicle to explain and or share how you can achieve different facets of optimization in your performance, but then in life. Now that seems very complicated, even for me saying that out loud. So let's really simplify it, saying we can learn how to become a top 10 tennis player, to work towards becoming one of the best tennis players in the world, whilst considering the elements in our life and to make sure they are helpful for our performance. And one such element is life, and it is what is also in your life other than tennis, because we want to make sure it's a positive influence. It's not pulling from your energy. It is not a negative influence. So let's hop off that, or hop on it, about that energy and the good and the bad. And this is something I think, obviously, I think the adults in the room are going to gravitate towards and better ascertain. But I'm really hopeful I'm going to simplify in a way that irrespective of what age you are, you're going to gravitate towards it. And it's as simple, obviously, as good or bad, but it's your inner circle. That energy, in whichever shape or form, let's say it's that vibe, that vibe that person's giving me, that makes me feel phenomenal and amazing. I want more of that. That vibe that other person is giving me, that just does not make me feel very good. It does not make me feel good about myself. I don't really want to fill my day with those type of vibes. Hopefully I did a very good job in simplifying that, because look, I know a lot of the time I do get carried away on that scientific side, and that's obviously that scientist in me. But it's so important to simplify, I think, these type of elements, because we want those tools. And a simple tool is having the capacity to make decisions, to be able to identify what is good for me and what is bad for me. Now, yes, very simple. However, as I touched on earlier, we're looking at the behavioral spectrum. And I have, I think, touched on that a little bit in the past, but I am writing about it at this stage, so I'm going to share a bit more here. And so when we're looking at that spectrum, it's also the spectrum of learning, it's a spectrum of development, and it's also, we can look at child development, the adolescence, but also the young adult, but also then the actual adult. And you go through different learning phases where you are more susceptible, you're more impressionable, and you can pick up habits that then are normalized, and the child is going to think that's okay. And you cannot blame the child for thinking that it is okay, because that is what has been normalized for them. That's where the coaches and parents come in to lead by example. If you have a parent and a coach that goes out every single weeknight and they do not come home till midnight, there's a very good chance when that player athlete has the chance to do it, they're going to do the exact same thing and think that is normal. You could have a coach that ignores every single player and does not listen to them, and they could go home, the player, the athlete, and decide that they're not going to listen to their parents anymore, and or their siblings, and or their teacher at school, because that role model in their life, that's what they do, so they have normalized that. These are very simple examples, but hopefully you get where I'm going. There can be more serious examples, which we're not going to dive into, but it's really showing the level of susceptibility a child is exposed to, and that it is not necessarily their fault because of those levels of exposure. What you can do for the adults in the room, though, is to set the healthy precedent, to set the good patterns. So again, with that humanized approach, we look at tennis specifically and the patterns of play on court that develop and lead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. They work in tandem with behaviors, yes, believe it or not, and they are in the 7 keys or wrapped up in there. And obviously one such behavior is the ability to understand, and wrapped up in there is the ability to listen. Coaches, parents, guardians, please take the time to understand your child and your player athlete. You need to be able to understand that, whether it's incredibly simple or complex. And to get to the root of that level of understanding, you're going to listen. As frustrating as it could be at times, you're going to need to listen. And we're going to build these habits, these healthy habits, to imprint in a manner of speaking onto that player, that child, that athlete. And this is how we build those healthy behaviors. We lead by example. If we ignore that, then you have a child essentially that's they're not too sure what the world is comprised of. They are learning as they go, as every child does. And if they do not have the guidance, they're going to trip a few times. They're going to make those mistakes until they have that guidance. Hopefully that guidance is good and that it's conducive for their performance. However, if it is not, they are not necessarily, there's a bit of a grey area here, at fault if that example has not been shown. There is a very, I think, significant argument, though, if they are old enough to know better, if the examples have been set, if they know the difference between rules and no rules, and what is acceptable in society and what is not. Those type of conversations, I think, are very different. But when we're really looking at that baseline level of how I think human behavior transfers into optimal performance success and those outcomes that are, I think, conducive on that pathway towards a top 10 tennis ranking, we can get quite intricate about the inner workings of the mind. So, and that's where you're really leveraging on neuroscience, but also mental health, and I think the crossover there to your emotional well-being. And again, we do have episodes on these topics and blogs specifically that are written about that. But we need to distinguish your mental health is going to be a bit different than obviously to your emotional health. And if you're taking the time to serve both, to feed both in good ways, in healthy ways, and then the third one we know is obviously your physical health. So let's say your performance base in this respect. And if you're doing good to serve all of them, or if you're neglecting one. And when we're looking at performance expectations, your mental side and your emotional side are the most vulnerable, and that's where the precedent needs to be set to make sure good foundations are in there and or not. So if we really want to just tie everything together inside that coach-athlete relationship, it really, the title says itself, because it's all about the relationship and how do you go about building effective relationships. So we've touched on this, I think, on multiple occasions, and it's underpinned by those pedagogic practices. So in a simplified way is your moral compass and your ethics. One of our most recent episodes, actually, so a couple back, was and or is on fair play and ethics, and it's such an important discussion to be had because it really sets the precedent for your moral compass. And if you're able to gauge, those ethics, those principles and those bounds and or the boundaries that confine that inner circle in a manner of speaking, you're setting yourself up to protect your health, your well-being. So, and obviously that encompasses your emotional and mental health. So you are on the pathway to looking after that side of your game. So obviously the secondary component, which really is the primary component then, is your performance. However, they work in tandem. Now, I really hope you're following along there, because that was quite complex. But when we're looking at, let's say, the coach-athlete relationship, the coach-parent relationship then is absolutely fundamental, because this is where we really tie everything together, making sure, as I think touched on a number of times now, the parent and or guardian is on the same page as the coach, or essentially you want the coach to be on the same page, and or I think the person that goes between what is going on, and being able to keep all 3 to 4 informed. Now, you can move the marker then as we progress obviously through the chapter. We've had a really, I think it's a ironic discussion, but it's so important, on hiring and firing your coach. And if you know it is not working for you, so this relationship is just no, it's that person, as in that coach, is not conducive. They are not relaying that positive message to allow that triangular relationship to happen. They are not driving those positive influences. They are not setting the stage to reduce the negative noise. They are not mentoring that child, that player, that athlete in healthy ways. I like to think that most coaches are, but it's being mindful of this, and it's such an important, I think, discussion to be had. And I do again obviously have a blog post specifically about this, but we want to talk about empowering that player, that athlete. And for the parents to guardians out there, it's about really informing you and educating you more succinctly on what comprises of a good coach. Now, there's a lot in obviously the 40 plus episodes now to date around this, but to really simplify it, just ask your child how they're feeling. Do they feel heard and understood and listened to? Do they feel like they're progressing towards getting better? Do they feel like whatever goal they may have, for argument's sake, let's say it's they want to head towards that top 10 tennis ranking, is their coach putting in the work and planning for them? Obviously, this is going to really differ depending on what your current ranking is, if you have one. Whether you are a top 20 player and your coach is really specifically putting in the work to develop those patterns of play, to increase the consistency and frequency of specific key parameters to allow you to reach that next peak performance, obviously at that elite echelon of play that we're talking about. Or you could be potentially top 200 looking to ascend towards the top 100, so you really want to ascertain what the 7 keys are and integrate them more firmly into your game, and that's going to help you progress towards 80, 60, 40 and so on. Is that the case? If you are 900, 800 in the world and potentially you are still at a club and or academy, is the work that you're doing paving the way for that top 500, top 300, so you can look at ascending more steadily and or progressively inside the top 100? We really want to ask the questions, is the pathway there? Do you know what's ahead of you? Do you know how to get there? I cannot tell you how many conversations I have had with aspiring elite athletes. So we're not talking about simply, the club and or academy level. They may still be based at a club and or academy, but they're looking at securing those initial ranking points, and or they already have those initial ranking points, but all they are doing is the same thing on repeat, and they are not adopting new practices. They are questionable on these newer patterns of play, and it's quite problematic when you're looking at ascending in the rankings, that you need to be open-minded to ensure you have the capacity to integrate what your game needs. needs and or what it's missing, which probably sounds quite simple. But when you are regimented, in a manner of speaking, in your way, and you think this has gotten me to this point, so it's really going to get me to the top 100, that's not necessarily the case. We've touched on multiple occasions why players inside the top 300, 200, they stay there, and why, and they could have been there for 2-3 years now, why they are not ascending inside the top 100. It's the same for the players who quite consistently hover outside the top 100, between 150 to 120 in the world. They are there, so they are missing out consistently on direct entry into Grand Slams, and this is almost on repeat. They're stuck. And again, we have touched on this, and it's like, why? We know that they have not ascertained those 7 keys. They have not been progressively integrating them into their game. And it is absolutely clear that whatever coach-athlete relationship they have, in effect, is not conducive with their performance now. It could have been previously, and it could have gotten them to this point, but that's the capacity of that coach-athlete relationship. It is capped, and you really need to then look at finding a coach who has a broader capacity. And you know that a coach has a broader capacity when they, 1, are privy to the 7 keys, 2, they are actually putting in the work to integrate each respective key individually and then collaboratively, which is really significant. If you are listening and you don't know, then that's what the 7 keys to optimize your life. Yes, the title is a play on word because it's twofold. It shows you how to optimize your tennis ranking towards that top 10, but it also shows you the rulers to transfer that to achieve the top 10% in life. And it uses that as a guide without directly saying to become the best in the world, because we know the skepticism around the scientific literature, which is quite concerning. But we say skepticism in respect to, for lack of better wording, uneducated. And I say uneducated for those who do not understand how scientific data works, the varying implications. Potentially you're listening going, well, no, that's not the case. Science is science, it's factual. We know it can uncover this, etc. But we do obviously know equally from the data that type of perspective does exist, and that is why this body of work has been shaped and or released in this way, to not necessarily counter it, but to show the progressive pathway towards a top 10 ranking, opposed to, let's say, giving it to you on a platter. Which this book really does, this new one underpins, because we know that if you were given it on a platter, so to speak, it doesn't work, which does sound quite confounding on face value. But it's, if you are given it, then you essentially forget it, or it's so much, it's the capacity is not there. Because at the end of the day, to get to a top 10 tennis ranking, we're talking about 10 to 20 plus years of work. It is continuous, and there are patterns of play that are ingrained into your game that are made, obviously, they reach that autonomous level, and then they reach that new peak performance level. And we're talking about those discrete skills that obviously comprise of that serial skill, and the adaptations that happen along the way, the modifications that are necessary. And that is just one piece of your game. A tennis player's game is multifaceted, and you've got different movement principles that you need to condition, and these are very progressive, and they can take 3 to 6 months plus to actually ingrain one new movement, and longer then to make sure it becomes a habitual part of your game. So it is quite complex, but it's possible. It just takes time. And so that's, I think, where this all ties in. So when, again, coach-athlete relationship, touching on hiring and firing your coach, it's really making sure you've got the right mix. And if you do not feel looked after in the best way, shape or form, potentially it's time to move over. And or if you're the coach here listening and or parent guardian, it's about having that conversation and upskilling, making sure you are privy, I think, to the 7 keys to begin with, and working with your player, that athlete, and really becoming that team unit. And again, building that healthy, that conducive coach-athlete relationship. Now, one of the other sections that we'll quickly dive into is talent identification in that coach-athlete relationship. If you are a coach who adheres to this, I really want to encourage you to have a look specifically at that episode. We have touched on it in one of our previous episodes as well, a recent one. And to really, I think, ascertain your why, because we know with what the literature says and what the data says that talent identification does not really serve a purpose when we're really looking at that healthy inner circle and the positive noise. If anything, it can influence negative noise, ironically, if it is not controlled, which we often find is the case, which does cross over then to that next aspect within the coach-athlete relationship, and it's the vulnerability of a player to, say, depression and or anxiety in sport, and it's invisible more often than not, especially on the tennis court. And the conversation around how coaches can help. So it's one of another aspects of that healthy coach-athlete relationship, of having that coach who is prepared to step up and help. And now this crosses then over into player behavior. And yes, I'm doing a recall of all the sections encompassed within that coach-athlete relationship that is really being dived into as a refresh. So player behavior, yes, it's your responsibility as a coach. And I think we've really touched on this about the mentoring and leading by example and having that capacity in that coach-athlete relationship. And recall how we spoke about building good behaviors, how from human behavior, child behavior, the impressionable child, and how impressionable that player athlete is, and how it's not their fault if the example has not been set. And obviously that does come with, that gray area, making sure code of conduct, for example, has been followed. But that's a really good example, because if you are on court and your coach, you see them screaming or throwing their racket when they're playing with their mate, and then you're that player that comes on court after seeing that and you think that behavior is acceptable because you've seen your coach do that. That is a completely valid and acceptable explanation for that behavior. So it really sets that precedent then for the coaches out there to really ask yourself what example you're setting. The same is apparent for the parents and or guardians out there and those behaviors. If you think it's acceptable to yell on the phone to your friend and be hysteric, there's a very good chance that your child is going to think that's normal. And it's really about being mindful of what you are normalizing. And if we, come full circle with this discussion and we're talking about the impacts of social media on this, so many things are being normalized, obviously, within this context. And now more than ever, we have the more impressions, which means we have access to silly numbers, whether it's, I'm not even going to say, because it's just absolutely silly numbers, the amount of content you can access directly online from people you don't even know, that aren't even in your inner circle. And if you see that a handful of times, you potentially are going to think that's normal. And from an adult's perspective, it might take, more than a few times before you normalize that, or you begin to question that level of judgment. But we know we need to be very mindful of that. What we see online is not necessarily how things should be, and or the precedent we want to set for that child and or player athlete. And this definitely crosses then over into mental stability, helping athletes cope with performance, because what they do view online within reason can affect their mental stability. And we also know now more than ever how susceptible, vulnerable that child, that athlete, that player is because of the alarming levels of negative noise that they can potentially be exposed to. That really sums up quite tightly and quickly the coach-athlete relationship and the key sections, which eventually finishes on the performance expectations. And I'm sure you can see with everything we've gone over today, the likelihood to experience pressure and or to feel pressure is absolutely astounding. There are so many direct and indirect influences that can amplify that for that developing athlete, but also that athlete who could potentially be in their early 20s arriving inside the top 80. It is still ripe hunting ground for pressure to be amplified. So setting those tools up early on, establishing good behaviors, good boundaries, having that inner circle nice and small, tight-knit, that is conducive for your performance, opposed to allowing that negative noise in, is absolutely fundamental. And I'm sure we're going to touch on this more in future episodes, but it's just so important to have the conversation again about how the expectations and pressure really, I think, interrelate with that coach-athlete relationship. And again, taking that humanized approach, everything we've touched on today is just equally as applicable in life. And we've touched on, that identity, where there is that player identity and that external identity. And so we don't want that whole player encompassing everything, but we really need to be mindful of protecting, I think, the person, the individual as a whole, and those who absolutely have an impact on those influences, especially when we're looking at heading towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for listening today. Part of me feels that was really complicated and deep and entrenched and that was a lot. But then I also think we had a very, simplified discussion on quite a number of areas of the coach-athlete relationship. Before, there was a really quick rehash. When I say quick, I'm pretty sure we rehashed a couple of chapters, if not all of them, within the space of 5 minutes, if not all less. Although I am not looking at my watch, maybe you are. To get a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Performance Success, head on over to AM8 International. That is am8international.com. For any comments or questions, head on to AM8 or Topic Thread. That's the social platform set on data privacy. And we really did dig into social media today and those platforms, and I did share examples from that. But it's really, I think, the conversation from my space to how I think versatile the landscape has come and or grown to. It can really be viewed in a good light, in a positive light. It just needs to be managed. And so I'd really encourage, let's say the adults in the room to help set those healthy foundations. But for those players out there who are inside the top 100, you could be top 30, top 20, or even top 10, I really want to encourage you to set your own boundaries, to set those own confines if you have not already. I know a lot of you have, and I think that's incredible, and I love seeing that. But I really want to encourage those who haven't to be really mindful of that presence, to protect that inner circle, and to ensure that negative noise remains external. I think that's it's just really important. And if anything, I hope that's one of the core, aspects you take away from today's episode. To interact with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, head on over to Twitter, Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. To catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok. And to catch up on our blogs, head on directly to AIM8 and look for our blogs tabs, or head on over to Medium. And as always, I will leave all the links in the episode notes. For something different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. To view this week's question and poll, be sure to visit Spotify if you're listening on another platform. If you are on Spotify, please do fill any of them out, the questions or the polls, because they really, I think, add further insights and help us shape future episodes. For something left afield, visit Sprout for some random polls. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. And look, for those of you who are interested, we do have scholarships available on AMA International, as well as options to work with me exclusively, specifically to nudge you closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking. However, places are limited, but don't be shy, come and say hi. On that note, as always, thank you so much for listening. I am so incredibly grateful. I am your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.